So before getting users, I think we should work on a session first. As you can see, we already have a socket event of session, but we don't have a session ID. So we'll create a session ID on a server. Here, below user ID, I'm gonna write session ID, and I'm gonna pass this inside our session. So just before user ID, I'm gonna say session ID, and say socket dot session ID. Then we're going to go on our client side. Here I want to say session ID. Then I want to bind socket.auth inside session. I want to bind socket.auth with my session ID, and then I want to store say storage.setItem session ID. I'm going to pass the session ID value. I want to store my session ID inside the browser, and I want to set it as local storage, so it's available across all the types. So now that we have this, we also need to check if the user is if the session ID is existing in the browser. So we need to check that the user has already logged in or not. So I'm gonna write a function over here, say check if user exists and constant check if user exists, and I'm going to use callback auto import callback. So whenever we write a use effect function, we need to write use callback, and inside this I have to have an array function and an array of dependencies. So here I want to check if the local storage has a session ID involved. So I'll say local storage dot get item, and it's a session ID, and I'm going to store this inside a constant. There you go. And I'm going to say if session ID exists, then I want to connect. So I'm going to say socket dot auth. Again, inside here, I'm going to pass session ID, which we will validate on our server side in just a second. And then I want to say socket dot connect. I also need to pass the socket object over here, as we are using as it's a dependency in this function. So now on our server side, before if we are refreshing, then it's going to come here. So we need to check if this session exists or not. So we are obviously going to have our auth our session ID inside our session.id object inside our auth variable. So I'm going to say constant session session ID to be precise, socket dot handshake dot auth dot session ID. So I'm going to say if there is session ID, then I want to find a session first. Find my session, and then if the session exists, so for now let's keep the session object to null, We're going to implement this function in the next video. So for now, I'm setting it to null. I'm setting this object to null. So if we have a session, I want to say socket dot session ID equals session ID, right? Here that we are having already. And so socket dot user ID equals session object dot user ID, and then I want to say socket dot username equals session dot username. So we are going to store all of these constants, our socket variables, socket assignments, which we are already doing over here, down here, when we are first logging in inside our session. So it will make much more sense when we implement our session storage function, our session storage JavaScript file in the next video. But for now, I'm going to say return next. I'm going to pass this to our next middleware function. So if you don't have a session, I'm just going to say, if you don't have a session, excuse me, I'm going to say return next with an error inside an error function. I'm going to say, oops, say new error, say invalid session. Yeah, that is it for our validating session. Now we need to implement our session.js, which we will do in the next video.